Hello, and
Morning.
welcome to this episode of Rule of Carnage. This is a series of conversations, podcasts, video-based chatathons between myself, Glenn Ford, a games designer and developer, and my friend Mike Hutchinson, also a games designer and developer, where being games design developers, we talk about fashion. No, we talk about designing better miniatures games because we've been designing some miniatures games and we're trying to get better at them.
Mm.
So, a question that popped up, I think, in the comment sections of the videos, which um, I've been trying to go through and harvest the comment sections occasionally because YouTube has chosen to stop notifying me when comments come up, so I have to go
Oh, that's sad.
and manually gather these things. I was asking about faction archetypes in miniatures games. Um, what are the usual faction archetypes that a player will expect to see? Maybe what are the ones that are useful for a game? And obviously, this has a certain amount of reach. I think, like the faction archetypes that you'll expect to see in a sci-fi game as opposed to a fantasy game, as opposed to a historical game, are going to alter a bit. People are going to expect to see
Interesting. Yeah,
goblins.
maybe. I hadn't considered that.
Hmm. In more abstract terms, there are a handful of gameplay mechanical archetypes that people
Mm.
expect to see. And usually, like, whenever I'm building a game, I list out a handful of the archetypes if I'm doing factions, and I try and build a faction that starts by hitting one of those archetypes and then spins off a little bit. And we'll talk a bit,
Mm.
I think, about like the way that factions, because faction and archetype slightly run up against each other, because one of the things that you want an archetype to do is use the standard mechanics of your game in a slightly standard way to achieve its goals. And one of the things you usually want a faction to do is break some of the rules of your game
Hmm.
in order to achieve its goals. So sometimes, like, an archetype and a faction can actually like rub up against each other, and the places where they create those friction are hopefully interesting bits of your design. So shall I take a stab at naming some archetypes? Because I know that you are literally looking at a spreadsheet as I'm saying this.
Well, I mean, I've got a list of 9 or something, that 10 that I came up with, but they're like fairly instinctual.
Mm,
This isn't a way that I design factions, and I haven't designed them like this before, but I'm trying to be a little bit more thorough in my, because I'm working on Billion Suns factions at the moment.
yeah, I mean, the general rule, like, I think mechanically for faction archetypes in games is that there tend to be uh 5 things that things do in games, which is move, shoot, punch, melee combat, try and survive, and other. And then there tends to be elite or non-elite in
Hmm.
each of those areas, and elite connects to less numerous, and non-elite connects to more numerous. And then you look at those 5 things and you apply elite or non-elite to each of them, and then you get an archetype of various sorts. And within certain genres, we have overarching archetypes that connect to each of them. So the non-elite in most things is going to be like goblins in fantasy. Elite in shooting, but not very good at being survivable, is going to be elves in fantasy.
Mm.
Elite in fighting, and very survivable and usually very elite in shooting is generally going to be dwarves. And
Mm.
so, but most of these things, you put the sliders up and down on each of those 4 main ones, and then usually you get like, oh, are we doing fantasy? Well, other is going to be magic, and then we're going to go up and down on magic, and that's going to add in another slider. Or are we doing like sci-fi? Well, other is going to be whatever psychic powers or
Yeah,
whatever.
or command effects or something.
Yeah, your sci-fi trope is. And again, yeah, in historicals, other is usually going to be command, leadership, things of that nature. And so basically push each of those 5 sliders up and down, and you'll usually find an archetype for the genre that you're sitting in. And yeah, that's the long and the short of, like, players are going to expect to see the sliders pushed in certain directions in certain genre games.
Mm,
Um, I think that in general terms, people expect to see numerous and rubbish,
mm,
elite and really good at face punching, elite and really good at shooting, and speedy fast mixed somewhere around those three.
mm.
Or like tanky slow, fragile fast, tanky slow, and usually applying fragile fast and tanky slow to goody faced punchy, goody shooty do, and rubbish at everything will get you like 6 archetypes that most people will go like, yep, okay, I know which one of those is my favorite. I'm very,
Hmm.
very quick to go like that's my guy. In any given game. So Mike, do you want to talk about the 9 archetypes that you're looking at for?
Well, I think what's fun is that you pulling out the like elite slider almost as a separate axis. That's really intriguing to me because that I was thinking I was just lumping like elite in as, one of these archetypes that you might want to build to, but you're absolutely right that like it's elite plus or it's numerous plus or in the middle it's like, it's like Goldilocks and shooting or something.
Yeah, I mean, generally everyone can do moving, face punching, shooting, and surviving, and it's a question of how good or bad they are. It's very rare that you get like in Warhammer Fantasy Battle, Chaos literally cannot shoot at all.
Mm.
In many editions until the Hell Cannon turns up and etc. etc. But it's very, very rare that one of those sliders is pushed so far that particular force just cannot do one of those 4 things in a
Yeah, and that
combat
like is
game.
for a fairly practical reason, which is that like you don't get to participate in a fifth of the game.
Absolutely. And then it's like how good they are at a given thing means they cost more points in almost every sane system, and therefore there are fewer of them. So it's a pretty simple like,
Mm.
and so of course my horde army is going to be rubbish at all of these things, and so it's like these sliders being pushed up and down naturally form most of the genre trope factions that we're aware of in most games. They form all of the literally every
Well, what
one
I
of
what I love
the
about it is
battle
it gives me a matrix that I can then explore, and I can say, well, look, I get that dwarfs are here, but what if I go here? Is there anything that like I haven't seen in that regard or that I want to put in? But anyway, to directly answer your question, so I was thinking in terms of like um a sort of a hammer, like aggressive, powerful at short range, like probably has to be like reasonably quick enough to get into melee. But that's your essential, your high up on the melee dial. But I wasn't thinking about that in terms of whether they're numerous or not. The second one was the like fast glass cannon. So it's like, yes, they're aggressive and powerful, but they're also like specifically very weak, and it's high risk, high reward, alpha strikey kind of glass cannony stuff. So
Mm.
those are sort of two flavors of short range aggression. Um, and I don't think they link to whether or not you're elite or not elite. It's just that like the survivee knob has been moved up and down, and the move knob has probably been moved up and down.
Yeah, I think like elite versus numerous kind of spins out the fact that it's like you push the slider up towards good, and each click costs an additional point, and then your game allows people X many points for things, and therefore inevitably something where all the sliders have been pushed up to the top is an elite force. You're not. It's
Right, so it's
I don't
almost
think.
it's an output rather than a dial.
Yeah, I don't think you generally start with like a faction archetype of going, well, it's going to be an elite faction, because it's like, well, that sort of like presupposes what it's going to be. You're like, okay, I want these guys to move fast and hit hard.
Yeah, although I
You know,
suppose if you were going through this as a sort of, I'm almost thinking of this as like an RPG character generation now, but it's like, okay, if it's an elite force, then I get 10 points to push up my sliders, where if it's a horde force, I'm only going to get 3 points to push up my sliders. And so like, yeah. But anyway,
yeah,
and then the next one on my list was the anvil, the defensive, attritional play, probably slow, definitely tough. Um, and like those three are like quite a fun sort of triangle just to begin with. And then I'd put the next two on my list were Swarm and Elite, which we've talked about, like swarming lots of poor quality models. That is something that like I as a player I might be attracted to be like, oh, where's the Horde army? I like playing the Horde army. Partly because like oddly enough, the elite versus horde or numerous thing, it ends up having this other axes of play, which is like elite armies tend to be more punishing to mistakes because you got fewer more important decisions, whereas a horde army you can like naff up a positioning or a move on a unit and it's only a smaller percentage of your force.
yeah. I suppose the other sort of slider you can play around with, and not all games have you play around with this, is chaotic and predictable. Like orcs and goblins are a great example of an army where you get even more stuff for your points than you would for, some other horde armies, because they're completely random at some times and they just do insane stuff and you never know what they're going to do. Whereas like undead, for example, are also a horde, but they are incredibly predictable horde. They never run away. They're even more predictable than like elite armies. So like how predictable versus chaotic, how much random number generation the force is going to rely on is often another like dial you can tweak on those things.
Yeah, that's cool because like it wasn't next on my list, but right on the bottom is chaos, wildly random and unpredictable for exactly that reason, which is that like some people just are drawn to the chaotic faction, the one that is going to some degree play itself, and to some degree that's because that one player might be because, well, I like working with a difficult challenge, and another player might be, well, I like divorcing myself from the outcome of the game.
There's also the inherent like gambler's attraction to a very
Right.
chaotic force, which is like usually with a chaotic force you get a points discount by virtue of how random it is, and then like one game in 100 all of your horses are going to come in, and this thing that has like blown itself up every other game just steamrollers the opponent, and you get to like have the experience of essentially laying a straight flush in poker and just be like, yeah, it's all luck, but my god, is it coming? My god, is it rolling for me today? And some people really love that. um I'd say one thing that I think is
Mm.
like interesting as sort of saying this is like, as you said there, you've got the anvil force, the dwarves, which is high on the survivability slider and tends to be low on the speed slider. And I was just sort of thinking, it's like there's not a lot of really fast moving, really survivable, but not very hard hitting forces out there. I wonder why, because
Yeah, because that would be like that, like in an objective play game, that would be a perfectly
mm,
viable build,
yeah, no, that'd
probably.
be like really functional. The thing that could just run up there, stamp itself onto the objective, and go, God, yeah, as everybody like piles into it,
Mm.
would be a viable force. But you don't see it, and I don't think it's because like tanky but not hitty backy is inherently unfun, because you get dwarf variations in like every single game, but they tend to be incredibly slow. And I wonder why it is that they're never just like fast is almost always linked to fragile, you know? And I don't know why that is. It's glass cannons are always, if something's quick, it's almost always a glass cannon. It's almost always or a helicopter or a chariot, which splits to pieces as soon as you touch it. I don't know why there aren't more.
Yeah, so it's fun here because like I'm literally imagining the spreadsheet that I'm going to build to like examine these possibilities and see like if there are some little corners. And it's not necessarily because I want to know, I want to be like, oh, I've made up a little faction archetype that didn't exist before, but I just kind of want to understand what people expect, where they come from, and like what, when I'm building into them. So this isn't on my list, but like as I was building one of the factions, it was um it's like a super like zealot faction, and it's like very much like about building in, I guess it's like really low survivability insofar as like you build some sort of wounds are a resource sort of suicide mechanics, so that you could deliberately consume your forces in order to do explosive bits of damage, which I suppose is like a really extreme far glass cannon.
Hmm. So, like, as I was sort of alluding to before, like in relation to factions, what factions tend to do is break the standard rules of your games. Where I think, like, the standard archetypes are sliding the sliders that already exist. Um, and in relation to like factional archetypes, you do tend to get the powers itself through its own damage sort of archetype, the sort of thing that gets stronger the more you hurt it. Either like gathering its own souls or getting enraged from pain or whatever it happens to be.
Mm,
It tends to be some form of summoner archetype in
mm,
most games. People like, there's almost always like an undead faction or an undead adjacent faction. People who can build little robots in a sci-fi game or open little warp
mm,
gates, whatever it happens to be. There tends to often be some level of vampiric faction, something that can get more powerful by hurting the other force.
mm,
You know, as I say, there tends to be a very chaotic faction, whether it's orcs and goblins that are very chaotic in hitting you, or Skaven that tend to be very chaotic in hitting themselves when their stuff blows up and does random things. Um, there tends to be, like I say, factions that will fiddle with whatever additional system that you've got going in, like magic, and there will therefore often be factions that fiddle with terrain by virtue of their magical abilities, either destroying terrain, moving terrain, letting themselves pass through terrain, letting themselves pass over terrain, letting them make terrain attack the other person or become dangerous to the other person.
mm,
Various ways of fiddling with that part of the engine. And then there will tend to be factions that fiddle with, if you have one, the objective system in a given
mm,
game, let you play around with scheme markers in Malifaux, or reduce or increase the number of victory points that can be generated from a train, from an objective, or like in Frostgrave, where you've got the wizard who can make an illusory treasure for people to gather, or move the treasure tokens around with spells, or even get an additional treasure token on the table. So that's
right. And so these aren't like I'm better at moving. It's like I'm interacting with some element of the game which isn't normally accessible in any way.
yeah, exactly. There's usually, archetype, factions that let you break the standardized rules of the game. And the rules of the game are: the more you get wounded, the weaker you get. Not for this faction. Me wounding you is its own reward. Not for this faction. I'm not allowed to fiddle around with the objective tokens. Not this faction. Terrain
Mm,
works in a certain specific and predictable way. Not for this faction. And the value of a faction is often, for many players, you know the moment where people go, can you do that, and you get to go, oh no, you can't do that, I can.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's part of the power fantasy because like the setting of the dials, we can sort of assume that even though individual models might not be as powerful as each other, like overall the armies are going to be roughly equivalent in power, otherwise the designer hasn't really finished designing the game. But the bit where I spot an opportunity to break the game's rules advantageously and you can't is like a real power fantasy moment.
Absolutely, and it's also like all of the dials are things like I can hit you and you can hit me, at range, close up. We can all do basically the same things to each other. You're
Mm,
better at one of them, I'm better at the other one. I try and apply the thing that I'm better at to you before you apply the thing that you're better at to me, and
mm,
the dance goes round. The faction rules, the bits where rather than like, you know, throwing punches at each other, I suddenly step in a completely different plane and poke you in the back of the head. It's where I rope a
mm.
dope or fly like a butterfly and sting like a bee. It's where I do something that you had no way should have no way of expecting. Obviously we've all got access to everybody else's rules, we
Mm.
actually know what everybody else can do, but it's the
If
moment where
only.
I potentially get to go like, right, this is the thing that my faction can do. You knew my faction could do this, but I'm combining that with this other thing, because I've spent longer looking at what my faction can do than you
Yeah.
have, and now you're going to go, "Wah!" and
Mm.
delightfulness ensues.
So
Um,
another couple of things that were on my list, which maybe we haven't touched on yet. So I had the aggressive, the glass cannon, the anvil. Then I had like control, so control, denial, mind games, unexpected twists, which might be in your lingo like a faction. This might be something that has cheat codes that break the game.
hmm.
But it might just be a sort of debuff situation where, like, well, I'm debuffing your move dial down because, when you're near me, it's everything swampy or whatever.
So like I'll try to dig it out, but a little while ago, one of the Discord members made an incredibly comprehensive spreadsheet of all of the mechanics in like of this type in miniatures games, the
Mm.
things that a thing can do that other things usually can't do, basically spreadsheet.
Ah, amazing.
And I'll try and
I
put
do
that.
remember. Yeah, I do remember that list going past a while back.
Yeah, I'll try and put that up on Google Drive and put a link to it down into the links section. But I think those are like the usual sorts of factions that you'd see in games. But I think more to the point, those are like the thinking and the motivation around various faction archetypes. It's about fulfilling the things that players usually like to do in a given game. There are certain players who like dancing around and not being hit, but like being needing to avoid being hit, and they love a fast moving glass cannon. And there are the people who just love weathering everything you can throw at them and then like punching you in the head, and those are the people that like the tanky armies, and like just making sure that you can, I think, at minimum, tick the boxes that the average player is going to expect to see in order to, tickle his particular fancy. And
Mm.
I think for that, that I think the short answer is that the things that have like nicknames are probably the things that you should have at least one of
Start
in your
with, yeah.
game. You should have a glass cannon. The reason the glass cannon exists as a nickname is that people like seeing glass cannons. You should have one of those. The reason
Mm.
that you should have something that can tank is that people like having things that can tank. Um, further thoughts before we.
I no, I think like it's been really interesting to get access to this definition between archetypes and factions in your lingo. Because
Hmm.
now I'm looking at things like I had one archetype that was called ninjas, which is like movement, tricks, and surprises, sneak, stealth. And that I'm thinking, well, like they're probably high on the move um dial, but they have access to something to do with like I can deploy in a way that other people can't deploy, or I can't be targeted at range, or I'm less effective. It's less easy to target me at range, which is, two places where I might be breaking the rules rather than emphasizing a particular capability. So this difference between what are the standard things that I'm emphasizing versus what's the unique cheat code that I'm getting is really interesting for me. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think like the thing to wonder. So I think most factions should be able to break the rules in some way. I think the thing to focus on is why you are allowing them to break the rules in the way that you are allowing them to break them. Because, like, if you are just letting them break the rules to just make them more effective at doing the thing that they're already quite effective at in a quite linear fashion, it's probably not worth letting them break the rules for that. Just like give them a stat bump up. What you want to do when somebody is allowed to break the rules is do the thing that they're good at, or sometimes the thing they are bad at, in a cool way. It's like I've got a faction that's really slow but very, very shooty, and what I'm going to give it is a power to like teleport once per game. They're not very good at moving generally. They want to hold a position and shoot. But what I'm going to let them do is like once per game, just break all the rules for movement and just go like I'm slow as anything, and you're going to have a hard time getting to me. But once I'm going to be allowed to, very very specific rules and etc. etc. Just go blink blank. I'm over here now, and that's my like party trick. You know, if you are going to give them a thing that makes them better at the thing that they're already doing it, giving them it in a way that's slightly sideways from something, don't give them something that could just be achieved by adding another number to an existing number. Give them something that lets them do it in a way that makes the other person sort of rock back on their heels and go like, that's outside of the way that I would expect you to be better at doing the thing that you're doing. I didn't realize that your shooting became suddenly more effective by the fact that you can do this one-off teleport. I
Mm.
didn't realize that your combat would be more effective because you can like, whatever, turn off my special weapon, or bounce back one of my shots at me. You're super tanky. You're not just super tanky, but you can use my attacks against me. That kind of thing. It can be sort of a powering up and a power fantasy, but you want to give them a rule that synergizes and breaks the rules in a sort of spin shot version of what they're doing, rather than just more of what they've already got going on.
Mm. Yeah,
Right.
that's cool. And that also, like, that's a fun little, if not a rule, but just like a little heuristic to be like, if something's all got their dial set low, consider having a special rule that like gives them a spike of power in something they're normally bad at.
Yeah, spike abilities are always lovely things to do with factions. Synergistics are always, lovely. Like in Boards and Black Flags, I've got an undead faction. Their special rule is that they can smash up their own, hit their own guys, and that they can choose to die when they fall over, which is both really rubbish special rules, but they're very bad at hitting things and they have explosive devices. So the fact that they can shoot their own guys who are going to hold still for them is great, because then they can get a nice easy shot and then they explode on people stood next to them. And because they're undead, they like can gather up souls. So the fact that you can choose to have your own guys next to the guy who is siphoning souls into himself is handy, because you can, by like a wraparound thing, you can choose to sort of sacrifice yourself, whereas normally you're like, oh, how am I going to kill the guy to get the souls? Well, I don't need to worry about it. I'll kill my own guy to get the soul. Thank you very much. And so like, particularly like faction special rules are rubbish, but synergize with the thing that you're doing in a weird way are always nice, because it gives players a sense of discovery when they figure out what the rubbish thing is actually for, and that it is a source of power for them. So
Hmm.
in a general sort of holding forth on the idea of faction construction and archetypes within factions, I think like most players of tabletop miniatures games have a favorite faction, the one that they immediately go to, the whatever it happens to be. If yours is tanky and fast but not hard hitting, which faction is that? let us know. Oh, I always go for the Bimbledubs. They're a
Yeah.
Bimble. I'd like to know. But swing down to the comment section. Tell us whether you love a bunch of glass cannons, a dancer faction, a slow rolling up, a gun line, whatever it happens to be. Tell us what your favorite faction is. Tell us why it is your favorite faction, and tell us what your favorite rule breaking ability for that sort of archetype faction is, and
Mm.
why you love that particular game lets you do that particular cool thing. As you're going down to the comment section, hit the like and subscribe buttons because it helps us out a lot. And check out the link section. In the link section, there'll be a bunch of things. One of them will
Destinations on the internet.
one of them will possibly be the Billion Suns beta. I don't
Oh,
know.
yes, it might be just coming to a close as we're speaking here.
It might just
Exciting.
be closing. It might have factions in it at this point. It doesn't at the point when I'm saying these words, but
It's
it might be
exciting,
the
isn't
point
it?
when you're hearing those words. There'll be links across to our Discord where people will be happy to hold forth on factions, design, skills, and abilities. Hopefully, there'll be a link to the spreadsheet of mechanics and abilities if I can find it and get it up online. So check that out because those are things like each one of which can create its own faction and archetype. There should be links across to our Patreons where you can support the channel directly, and links to various places where you can buy our wares in order to support the channel indirectly. But for now, I think from this episode of Rule of Carnage and the two of us, it's going to be a thank you and goodbye. So, a thank you and goodbye. Bye bye.
Cheers. Bye bye.